Hi friends, welcome to our channel The Dental Educators. In today's lecture we will be discussing about the different type of tooth numbering systems. Basically we will focus about the background in today's lecture, that what was the tooth numbering system and how they came into being. And then we will discuss about the particular type of tooth numbering system, that is a Zygmondes or Palmer notation system. Whereas in the upcoming lectures we will be discussing the rest of the tooth numbering systems. Till date, there are many tooth numbering systems which have been reported, but only 3 of them are being commonly used. So let's go with the background. So what is the tooth numbering system? In clinical practices, some tooth numbering systems or tooth notation systems are very necessary to record the data. They are also referred as the shorthand systems. In 1947, American Dental Association recommended the first kind of tooth numbering system, that is known as Zygmondes or the Palmer system, as the method of choice. Whereas in 1968, ADA later on recommended universal numbering system, as there were some difficulties while inputting the data using the Zygmondes numbering system because of the symbolic representation. Basically, we have 3 different type of tooth numbering systems which are commonly used. The first one is Zygmondes or the Palmer notation system. The second one is the universal notation system, and the third one is the Federation Dentary Internationally system, or you can say it as FDI system as well. In today's lecture, we will be just focusing about the first type of tooth numbering system which was reported earlier, that was the Zygmondes or Palmer notation system. So looking at the background of the Zygmondes or Palmer notation system, we can see that in 1861 Adolf Zygmondes was the first guy. He reported a symbolic system for permanent dentition, whereas later on in 1874 it was modified for the primary dentition. What we do in this kind of system, let's go for the primary dentition first, because these teeth erupt first in the oral cavity. In this system, first we divide the whole oral cavity into quarters, that means in quadrants. The word quadrants basically comes from the word quarters. So the entire dentition is then written in the uppercase letters in the case of the deciduous dentition. So if we see here in this symbolic representation, you can see for in the case of Palmer notation system, first we draw up a symbol kind of thing, like a horizontally flipped L shape. So you can see after drawing this horizontally flipped L shape for the upper right maxillary quadrant, you write down the tooth number for each of the specific teeth. We count from the midline. So if we make up a midline in the center, so after making up a midline in the center, we mark the first maxillary central incisor as A inside this symbolic representation, whereas the next tooth is represented as B, that is the maxillary lateral incisor of the upper right quadrant. Then for the canine, we write it as C, and for the first molar of deciduous tooth dentition, we write it as D, whereas later on for the fifth tooth in the upper right deciduous dentition, we mark it as E, that is the deciduous second molar. Now we can see that always we will count the teeth from the midline in the distal direction, away from the midline. Okay, so it's going from A to E. So it will be the same pattern for the maxillary left quadrant as well. We will draw up a symbolic representation, but in this case the symbol direction has changed. It appears to be in an L shape, representing that it is for the maxillary left quadrant. So we can see here this line which is in the upward direction basically represents, thus we are discussing about the maxillary arch, and the line which is straight like this, it divides the maxillary and mandibular arch in separate from each other. Now again we will count the teeth in a similar way. We will mark the central incisor of the maxillary left quadrant as A, maxillary lateral incisor as B of the left quadrant, C for the canine of the maxillary left quadrant, D for the first deciduous molar for the left quadrant, and the last one E for the deciduous second molar for the maxillary left quadrant. Keep in mind we have 5 teeth in each of the dentitions, that is from A to E, starting from the central incisor going on to the lateral canines, first molar and the second molar. Now going towards the mandibular arch, we see that we draw up a symbolic representation again. So again we draw up first this straight line which is dividing the maxillary and mandibular arch from each other. Then we draw up a second line, but now we can see it has a downward direction. So it is a so-called vertically flipped L shape for the mandibular left quadrant. After making up this kind of symbolic representation, we again start to count the teeth from the midline from A to E, in which A is representing the mandibular central incisor of the left quadrant, B representing the mandibular lateral incisor of the left quadrant, C representing the mandibular canine of the left quadrant, D representing the mandibular first molar of the left quadrant, and finally the E representing mandibular second molar of the left quadrant. Now again, the key thing to understand is that we always count the tooth from the midline towards the distal direction for each of the quadrants. Now lastly, coming on to the last quadrant, that is the mandibular right quadrant, we make up a symbol which is quite different. We can't say it horizontally or vertically flipped shape L, but it is a kind of an L shape but in a different pattern. So again we can see we draw up a first straight line which basically represents that we are separating the maxillary and mandibular quadrant, and after making that straight line we make up a line which is going in the downward direction so that we can discriminate between the right and the left quadrant for the mandibular arch respectively. Then again we start to count the teeth from the midline, that is we mark it as A for the mandibular central incisor of the lower right quadrant, B for the lateral incisor of the right quadrant, C for the canine again for the mandibular right quadrant, D for the deciduous first molar of the mandibular right quadrant, and finally E, that is for the deciduous second molar of the mandibular right quadrant. So now let us see in the diagrammatic representation that how we are counting all of the teeth as per the Palmer or the Zsigmondy's notation system. So what do we do in the diagrammatic representation? First we need to make up a symbol as we discussed earlier in the previous slide. So we make up a symbol like this, that is a horizontally flipped L shape for the maxillary right quadrant, and then inside this symbol we need to write the specific tooth alphabet. Okay, so each respective tooth is given an alphabet separately. So we can see here above, we first make up a symbol like a horizontally flipped L, then we write A for the deciduous maxillary central incisor, then in this symbol we write B for the deciduous maxillary lateral incisor of the right hand side, and again we make up a symbol like this, we write C in it for the canine of the maxillary right quadrant, then we again make up a symbol like this and we write D that represents the maxillary first deciduous molar of the right quadrant. Then the last tooth in the maxillary right quadrant is the deciduous second molar, which is represented as E in this symbolic representation. So the key thing to understand is the symbol. If you draw up an incorrect symbol, it will represent a wrong side or the wrong quadrant. So it goes the similar way for the maxillary right left one, that what we do, we again make up a symbol like this, which is normal L shape, and after making an L shape, within that L we write the tooth number in the case of like in uppercase letters. So representing again the same way for the maxillary left central incisor, which is mentioned as A inside that symbolic representation, lateral incisor as B inside that symbolic representation, canine represented as C inside that symbolic representation, first deciduous molar of the maxillary left quadrant represented as D inside that symbolic representation, and lastly the second deciduous molar of the left quadrant represented as E inside that specific L-shaped symbolic representation. It will be the same way we will see for the mandibular arch as well, but the symbol for the left mandibular quadrant has changed. Now it is referred as the vertically flipped L shape. You can see it's in a different direction as compared to the maxillary arch. So we again mark them after making the symbol in this way, all the teeth in the alphabetical order from A to E. That is, the A will be the mandibular central incisor of the left quadrant of inside the symbol. For the mandibular left lateral incisor, we draw up this vertically flipped L shape, and then we write B for the lateral incisor. Then again we draw up the respective symbol and we write C in the symbol. Then we draw up another respective symbol for the mandibular left first molar, and in that we write it as D. And lastly, for the deciduous mandibular second molar, we will again draw up that symbol to represent that it is the left hand side tooth, and to represent the second molar we will write it as E. Now last quadrant, that is the mandibular right quadrant, we draw up the symbol like looking similar to an L shape but in a different direction. Now we will, after drawing that respective symbol, we will write down the alphabet for each of the respective tooth in the same way which we have been discussing earlier. A, which is representing the mandibular central incisor of the right quadrant in that symbol. So this symbol which represents for the right quadrant. Then for the lateral incisor we write as B. For the canine in that symbol we write as C. For the first deciduous molar as D. And lastly for the second deciduous molar, which we will write it as E. So let's go through the video demonstration now, in which we will show and discuss how we are counting all of the teeth. Now going through the video demonstration, we will discuss that how are we dividing the teeth in different quadrants and how we count them as per Palmer. So for the upper right hand side, we draw up a horizontally flipped L. For the upper left hand side, we will draw up a normal L shape. To represent the lower left hand side, we will draw up a vertically flipped shape L to represent all of the teeth, and then we will mention the teeth in the symbol. And for the lower right hand side, we draw up a symbol like this and we write down the tooth number for the right hand side respectively. So counting from the midline, first we draw up a midline between the two central incisors of the maxillary arch. Then we first make up a symbolic representation for the upper right hand side, and within that symbol we write the tooth number, that is the maxillary central incisor, as A, lateral as B. For the deciduous right maxillary canine, we write it as C in that symbol. For the first molar, we write as D in that symbol. And lastly, for the deciduous maxillary right second molar, we write as E. Now looking for the upper left hand side, the first thing is we draw up a L-shaped kind of symbol. Then we start to count the teeth from the midline, that is the first central incisor, and we will write it as A inside that symbol, B for the lateral incisor inside that symbol, C again for the canine which we mention inside the symbol, D for the first deciduous molar of left hand side, and E for the second deciduous molar inside that symbolic representation. Now looking for the lower left hand side, we will draw up a vertically flipped kind of shape, L shape, and then in that L shape we will write down the first mandibular central incisor, because from the midline this is the first tooth on the left hand side. So we will be representing it as tooth number 1 inside that symbolic representation. So for the lateral incisor, we will write it as the second tooth as B. For the canine, we will write it as C. For the first deciduous molar as D. And inside that symbol for the second deciduous molar, we will write it as E. So all the deciduous dentition in Palmer notation system is mentioned in alphabetical order. So for lower right hand side, we draw up a symbol like this first. Then we start to count from the midline towards right, that is for the deciduous central incisor as A inside that symbol, for lateral as B, for canine as C, for the deciduous right first molar for as D, and for second molar we will mention it as right E. Now for the permanent dentition, we again make up the four quadrants to represent the symbolic representation, and we start to count the teeth again from the central incisor to the last tooth in each of the quadrant. So as we know that in permanent dentition, in each quadrant we have 8 teeth, that is the central incisor, lateral incisor, canine, first premolar, second premolar, first molar, second molar, and third molar. So we will give each of the tooth a specific number. So we will do up a similar thing as we did in the deciduous dentition, but rather than marking the teeth alphabetically, we mark them with the numbers. So what do we do here? We make up a symbolic representation for the maxillary right quadrant, like a horizontally flip shape L as we discussed earlier. Then we write down all of the teeth in the form of numbers going from the midline. So the first tooth from the midline is the first permanent central incisor of the right hand side, which we write as tooth number 1. The second tooth from the midline for the maxillary right quadrant is the lateral incisor, which we write as number 2. The third tooth is the canine for the maxillary right quadrant from the midline. So the fourth tooth from the midline is the first permanent premolar. The fifth tooth from the midline is the second permanent premolar. Now the sixth tooth from the midline is the first permanent molar. The seventh tooth from the midline is the second permanent molar, and lastly the last tooth in the maxillary right quadrant is the third molar. So we don't have any deciduous teeth which we label as in the form of numbers. We just label all the permanent teeth in the form of numbers. Now again, counting from the midline, we go away from the midline from the central incisor to the third molar. Now going on to the second quadrant, that is the maxillary left quadrant. Similar to the deciduous dentition as we discussed earlier, we draw up a normal L shape, and within that L shape we number each of the respective tooth in the maxillary left quadrant. So the first tooth in the maxillary left quadrant from the midline is the maxillary central incisor, okay, which is numbered as number 1. The lateral incisor is numbered as number 2. The canine is numbered as number 3. The first premolar is numbered as 4, the second premolar as 5, the first permanent molar as 6, second permanent molar as 7, and the third molar as 8. The key thing to remember, as we have been discussing earlier, is the symbol. So the upward direction basically represents that this is for the maxillary arch, and the direction of this line represents if it is for the maxillary right hand side or the left hand side. Okay, so this symbol is of key importance. In a similar way, we represent all of the mandibular teeth as well. So for the mandibular left quadrant, we draw up a vertically flipped shape L kind of symbol. Later, after drawing that symbol, we number all the teeth from the midline to the third molar. So the first tooth in the midline of the mandibular left quadrant is the permanent mandibular central incisor. The second is again the lateral incisor. The third is the canine. The fourth is the first premolar. Fifth is the second premolar. Sixth is the first molar. Seventh is the second molar, and lastly eighth is the mandibular left third molar. because we are writing all of the teeth in the particular kind of symbolic representation. Now lastly, when we come to the last quadrant, that is the fourth quadrant or the mandibular right quadrant, we will again draw up a symbolic representation like this. After making up the symbolic representation, we will number all of the teeth away from the midline. So the first tooth in the midline of the mandibular right quadrant is again the central incisor, which is numbered as 1, lateral as number 2, canine as number 3, first premolar as number 4, second premolar as 5, first molar as 6, second molar as 7, and lastly the third molar as number 8. So key thing to remember is the symbol. Remember, the symbol is of key importance. Now let's go through the diagrammatic representation, in which we will be discussing for each of the individual tooth in a quick way for the permanent dentition as we did for the deciduous dentition. Now again we will draw up a symbolic representation which is a horizontally flipped L kind of shape. Now after drawing that horizontally flipped L kind of shape, we can see each of the respective tooth is given a particular kind of number. So after drawing that symbol, the maxillary central incisor in that symbol is numbered as 1, the lateral as 2 in that symbol, the canine as 3 in that respective symbol, the first premolar as 4, the second premolar as 5, the first molar as 6, second molar as 7, and lastly the third molar in that respective symbol as 8 for the maxillary right quadrant. Now for the maxillary left quadrant, we draw up a L kind of shape to represent the left quadrant. So in that quadrant shape, we number each of the respective tooth from away from the midline. So the first tooth in the midline is the maxillary central incisor, which is numbered as 1 in that respective quadrant shape, the lateral as 2 in that respective quadrant shape, 3 for the canine in that respective quadrant shape, 4 for the first premolar in that respective quadrant shape, 5 for the second premolar in that respective quadrant, 6 for the first molar, 7 for the second molar, and lastly 8 for the third molar. Now it happens the same way for the mandibular arch as well. So the mandibular left quadrant, after making a vertically flipped L kind of shape symbol, we count the teeth away from the midline. So the tooth which is in the midline, that is the central incisor, will be labeled as number 1 in that respective quadrant shape, lateral as 2, canine as 3, the first premolar as 4, second premolar as 5, first molar as 6, second molar as 7, and lastly the third molar as number 8. It will be the same way we will count the maxillary left teeth in a similar way after making that specific shape, and we will give them the numbers from 1 to 8. Now let's see in this video demonstration that how are we numbering all of the teeth on the model. So the important thing which we will be seeing here, that for the permanent dentition we draw a same kind of symbol which we drew in the deciduous dentition, that is the horizontally flipped shape L, normal L shape, vertically flipped L shape for the lower left quadrant, and normal L kind of symbol, different L kind of symbol for the mandibular right quadrant. So after drawing the symbol, that is a horizontally flipped shape kind of L for the maxillary right quadrant, we number all of the teeth and write down the number of the respective tooth inside that quadrant shape. So after making this symbolic representation, we will start to number the teeth away from the midline. Okay, so the tooth which is closest to the midline in the center is the maxillary central incisor, which will be numbered as number 1 inside that symbol. which is the first tooth from the midline. Then we later on go in the distal direction from the mesial towards the distal direction. So again we will draw up a symbol. Then for the next tooth, that is the lateral incisor, which is the second tooth from the midline, the after from the central incisor, the second tooth from the midline is the lateral incisor, that will be numbered as 2, which we will write it in the symbolic representation. Then the canine will be represented as 3 in that respective symbol. First premolar as number 4, second premolar as 5, first permanent molar as number 6, second permanent molar as number 7 in that symbolic representation, and lastly the third molar as number 8 inside that symbolic representation. So in this case we drew up a horizontally flipped shape L for the to show the upper right quadrant teeth. Now for the upper left hand side, we will draw up a normal L kind of shape symbol, which we can see here. If we first draw up a normal L kind of shape symbol, then inside that symbol we write down the specific tooth number for each of the individual tooth. So again in this case as well, we will count from the midline and we will mark the maxillary central incisor of the left side as tooth number 1 inside that symbolic representation, lateral as tooth number 2 inside that symbol or symbolic representation. Now we will go towards the canine, that is distally third tooth, and first premolar 4th, second premolar as the 5th tooth inside that symbolic representation, first permanent molar as the 6th tooth, second permanent molar as the 7th tooth inside that symbolic representation, and lastly the third molar, which will be numbered as number 8. Now going towards the mandibular arch, for the left mandibular quadrant we will draw up a vertically shaped flipped L shape, which is a quite different from the normal L shape. We can see it's a vertically flipped L shape. First, that will be representing the symbol. So counting from the midline, the mandibular central incisor is marked as 1, lateral as 2, canine as number 3 from the midline. The first premolar again is the 4th, second premolar as 5th, first molar as 6th, second molar as 7, and lastly the third molar as number 8. Now going on to the last quadrant, that is the lower right quadrant. So for the lower right quadrant, we again make up a else kind of symbol, and in that symbol we write down the tooth number: 1 for central, 2 for lateral, 3 for canine, 4 for first, 5 for second premolar, then first molar 6, second molar 7, and lastly the third molar we number it as tooth number 8. So we counted all of the teeth away from the midline and we will write down all the tooth number inside this symbolic representation. So that's all with the Zygmondi's notation system or the Palmer notation system we discussed today. In the upcoming lectures, we will be discussing the rest of the two tooth numbering systems, that is the universal numbering system as the FDI numbering system as well. So